God's choice of the songs for this evening. As I mentioned this morning, this lesson really goes a little bit with what we studied with our class on Wednesday night when we were talking about trying to understand the authority for certain things of why we do what we do. And in that, talking about sometimes when we have disagreements with one another, trying to deal with some of those. But one of the things I wanted to do tonight is to go through one of the issues that I mentioned in passing in that class, and that has to do with the use of instrumental music in worship. And there's really a couple of reasons I want to do this lesson. The first reason is for all of us to make sure that we know why we're doing what we're doing based on the scriptures. There may be some things that some of us have heard these type of lessons several times. Maybe some of us have only heard it once. Maybe some have not really heard a full explanation of this topic. The second thing is, and I believe it's also important, is that to me, the study through the authority of why we do or do not use instrumental music is a great case study on how we understand why we do anything. And that gets a little bit to Sam's class this morning, is the need to, if we're going to avoid all kind of vain discussions, well, understand how do we know why what we practice is what God teaches, or that we can reasonably determine that that is what God teaches, or how can we analyze anything that we have a question about. And I think the study of instrumental music in worship covers so many areas that helps us to do it. So not only is it understanding this issue itself, but the second thing is just also look at it as how we use Bible authority to determine what we do individually and what we do as a church. And you know, it may be one of these things is you've got a question in your mind. Maybe you just like even some who often visit with us very quickly notice that we don't use instrumental accompaniment. We don't have pianos, we don't have organs, we don't have a band up on stage. And they ask, you know, why don't you use musical instruments? And we want to be able to answer those things. And so the real question, and sometimes the biggest way to address an issue, is to really find out what is the question that I'm answering. Oftentimes there are things that can be so complex and so difficult, but when we can get to what is the question that I'm answering, and really is it authorized in the New Testament? Is the use of instrumental music in worship authorized in the New Testament? So I'm already narrowing. I'm not talking about instrumental music like if you're in band at school and you're in the marching band, or you're in a band that plays music that's not worship music, that you're not talking about outside of the assemblies, listening to the radio. We're narrowing it to the time we're in the assembly. So sometimes half the issue is asking a good question. And so one of the things that I think I'll be able to demonstrate is that singing in worship without instruments is clearly commanded and approved in the New Testament. There's not going to be any doubt, I think, when you go through the scriptures, through the New Testament scriptures, that singing for sure is absolutely commanded and approved. And I believe we can establish that without instruments also follows in that. So let's look at the New Testament passages, and because we've got a lot of material to go through, I put most of the passages on the overhead. In Matthew chapter 26 and verse 30, and Acts 16 and verse 25, we have two historical observations of what believers did. One still takes place in the Old Testament area, in Matthew 26 and verse 30. Jesus and his disciples, on the night of the crucifixion, they had sung a hymn and they went out to the Mount of Olives. But it's in the New Testament, so I'm mentioning it, though technically it's under the Old Testament period. In Acts chapter 16 and verse 25, Paul and Silas are in prison, and at midnight they are singing praises to God, and the prisoners heard them. Now you're going to say, okay, well, that also kind of easy to explain. They probably wouldn't let them take a lot of instruments into the jail. But it's just to show you, historically, we know for a fact that these were some practices. In Romans chapter 15 and verse 9, Paul mentions in that passage, "For this cause I will confess to thee among the Gentiles and sing unto thy name." And 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 15, "I will sing with the Spirit, I'll also sing with the understanding also." When he's talking about spiritual gifts, he talks about praying in the Spirit, praying with the understanding. And here he also says, "Sing with the Spirit and sing with the understanding." One of the things I think we take from that is what we sing is something that has to be meaningful, something that has understanding, not any kind of gibberish. Some of the key passages that we will focus on, Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 19, and Paul writing to the church in Ephesus, he says, "Speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord." He talks about this relationship to one another. He talks about the types of things, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, which are three categories of songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Well, we'll dwell on that just a little bit towards the end of the lesson. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 16, it's talking about don't be drunk with wine, which is debauchery. Don't be filled with those kind of things. Be filled with the Spirit, and let the word dwell in you richly in all wisdom. And if the word's dwelling in you richly or fully in all wisdom, then what comes out? God's word. Teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. So here again, we have the conveying of words that are praise and edification, making melody in our heart to the Lord. And there's one other passage, James chapter 5, verse 13, "Is anyone married? Then let him sing psalms." And so when we look at the issue, we clarify the issue, nobody disagrees that singing is a commanded part of worship. In the verses that we just read, musical instruments are absent from these verses. So you've got to find what is where do we insert instruments? How do we get the authority to that? I will observe there never has been a division among God's people since the establishment of the church over whether singing was authorized in the assemblies. There never was a question that singing was something that we ought to do. The division has been when people try to introduce instruments into the worship. There was an article that I read, and it's an older article, and the article was written to defend the use of instrumental music of worship. And one of the approaches he takes is one that you'd be wise to realize or be aware of, because a lot of people will do this. He takes an issue that is clearly taught in the scriptures, and he gives it a nickname that sounds kind of derogatory. So he says the sing-only doctrine. So it's like, okay, well, if you command, you can only say, well, you just follow the sing-only doctrine. Like this is something we have made up. It says the sing-only doctrine continues to divide those who might otherwise be able to communicate with each other and resolve the other remaining differences. And so here, the person who is advocating instruments says it's all these people who just want to sing that's creating the division. It's like, no. If we're all singing, which is where we started, we've got no problem. It's when you come and bring in something that we did not have. That author is either very willingly ignorant of church history or is deceitful, because division always arose by the introduction of the musical instrument, not the removal. Nobody ever fought, because you're taking it out, is fighting and bringing it in. One of the things we note too, historically, the church only had vocal music, not only outside of the scriptures. You look in the early history of the church, you find the historical practices of early Christians is not the source of authority for what we practice. We don't say, well, the reason we do it is because Clement of Rome did this and Jerome did that, but if you, as we mentioned Wednesday night, if you look at the writings of those who were very close to the time of the apostles, who were very close to the establishment of the church, and you see what their practice was, it does give you insight as to what the early church, the closest to the apostles, closest to the establishment, understood about what they were supposed to do in their practices. And so when you study that, you find that church historians note that instrumental music started to be introduced into church worship around the 8th century. So around 700s BC, you had different groups start bringing them in. And even then, their introduction was often challenged as being something that was worldly. And so we want to look at some of the arguments for instrumental music in worship. And so we're going to populate this chart as we go through this lesson. The first argument that people make, well, instruments were used in the Old Testament with God's approval. And actually, that's not a bad argument. That's not a bad argument because you're respecting the authority of God. You're acknowledging the truth of what the Old Testament teaches. So it's not like you're trying to appeal to some non-biblical authority. You are looking to what God, had approved at some point. And that's generally a good place to start. So it's not the worst way to try to support the introduction of instrumental music. And we find that instruments were used in the Old Testament temple worship with God's approval. 1 Chronicles 25, if you spend time in there, you'll find where David organized priests who were priestly musicians for the tabernacle worship, and that continued on when Solomon built the temple. And even when the reformers like Hezekiah restored the temple worship, this was part of what they restored. You can go through many of the Psalms, and Psalm 150 is probably the Psalm of Psalms when it comes to describing all kind of instrumental music, that instruments that are used in praise to God. It lists all these different types of instruments, some of which I'd never heard of except for within the Psalms. It's interesting, though, those who would go to the Old Testament to try to bring those practices often don't bring a whole bunch of other practices from the Old Testament into the New Testament worship. And we find that there are many things that God approved of in the Old Testament that he does not command today. The burning of incense in a ceremonial worship way is not something that was commanded in the New Testament, nor something practiced by the early church. Dancing is not something that's practiced by the early church, commanded in the New Testament, and yet we find examples of joyful dance and worship in the Old Testament. Blood sacrifices, sprinkling of the blood on people, those type of things we don't find practiced in the New Testament. So there is a difference between what was done in the Old Testament and what was done in the New Testament. The most important thing to remember, though, is that the old law was a covenant with the Jewish nation, an agreement with the Jewish nation, and it's not binding on Christians today. So anything that was authorized under the Old Testament doesn't mean that it's authorized for non-Jews, doesn't mean that it's authorized for the church. And also, the more important thing we find is that the old law is not binding on Christians. Just several verses out of the New Testament that I can pull out. Ephesians 2, verses 14 through 15, for he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, thus making peace. Romans 7 and verse 4 and also in verse 6. Likewise, my brothers, you also have died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that you may bear fruit from God. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not the old way of the written code. And Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 and verse 9, for since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make those who draw near perfect. I deleted that. Then he added, behold, I have come to do your will. He does away with the first in order to establish the second. And so he's abolished the old law. Now, some people will counter. They say, well, but the Psalms aren't law. And the Psalms are what describe worship and using instruments. Well, Jesus considered the Psalms part of the law. In fact, the Jews did as well. John 10 and verse 34, Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law? I said, you are gods. And where that is mentioned is in Psalm 82. In John 15:25, but the word that is written in their law must be fulfilled. They hated me without cause. That appears in 3 Psalms. 1, it's kind of expressed in a different way, but 2, it's hated me without cause is pretty much straight on. So the Jews considered, and especially the lawgiver Jesus, considered that the Psalms were part of the law. They did not recognize any kind of break between ceremonial law or something in the Psalms and the rest of the law. And so we find that the Old Testament is not the authority for Christian worship. So while it is commendable to go to the Scriptures, we've got to apply the Scriptures correctly. And the Old Testament is not our authority for the things that we do in the church. And so the other thing people may argue, say, well, there are musical instruments in heaven. And I put a question mark because the only places they go to quote to demonstrate this is from the book of Revelation. So let's look at 3 passages from the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 5 and verse 8. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. This is a rather interesting one. I think I'll repeat a point on this a little later. First of all, there's living creatures that are not members of the church, but they are specially created heavenly creatures. And not only do they have a harp, they have golden bowls full of incense. And those who say, well, here, we need to have instruments, don't say, well, okay, look, in your other hand, you better have a bowl of incense. Revelation chapter 14 and verse 2, and I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many thunders and the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. This is one that's often used, except for I highlighted the word like, because he's just doing a comparison. He's not saying he heard a bunch, he heard a harp concert going on in heaven, but rather the sound was like many waters, and it was sound like many harpists playing on harps. Revelation chapter 15, verse 2, and I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mingled with fire, and also those who had conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hand. So here were people, but now they have died and they have gone on. And it may be some of these had been faithful Jews, and then some are Christians, but they are no longer part of the church on earth. They are the church in heaven. And I don't want to harp on this, but the only instrument that they ever mention is harp. And I've never been to a church, I'm sure they have some, where the only instrument is a harp. They will say, well, the book of Revelation has harps, and then they want to bring in a rock band. So where's your harp? Maybe they bring a harpsichord. I don't know. But when we look to the authority in the book of Revelation, here again, I commend. It's in the New Testament. So at least you're not trying to appeal to the Old Testament, so that is commendable. Revelation is a very highly symbolic prophecy. It contains a lot of elements that people don't try to authorize in worship. We have the bowl of burning incense. They don't say, hey, we got to be carrying around bowls of incense while we worship. No, we don't see those type of things. And we see specifically created heavenly beings, or those who died, that are pictured making music, but it says nothing about those who are in the church today on earth. And if we look at those passages, and again, don't want to harp on it, but it would demand that every worshiper would have a harp. Because the way that Revelation 5 and verse 8, it says they all had one and they played it. In Revelation chapter 52, they all had harps of God. So it's not like, oh, we authorize instruments and okay, Titus or Levi, come over here and play. It's like, no. We're an all congregation band. Pick your instrument. There's a preacher named Gary Hargis who said, if I thought he kind of said it best, if when I get to heaven, God places a harp in my hand and tells me to play, then fine, I'll do the best I can. But since he hasn't done it here on earth in the church, I better leave that alone until I get to heaven. I really think that is the right observation on that. And this very poor scriptural interpretation to use symbols used by heavenly beings who were not bound by an earthly New Testament covenant to authorize practices that we are to do as earthly beings here on the church. So we find musical instruments in heaven, yeah, but in a highly symbolic book, and it still is nothing about what takes place in the church. Well, then some will say, well, a piano is just like the pitch pipe, or in my case, my pitch pipe app that I use. That I play it, and then I get the pitch, and then I start the song. Well, if you look about any dictionary, music is going to have this definition, some form of it, that music is a combination of notes to form a melody or harmony. And so the first question, if somebody says, hey, look, you're bringing an instrument in already, you're bringing that pitch pipe in or that pitch pipe app, and you're playing, an A flat right there in the assembly, well, the pitch pipe does not make melody or harmony. You can't play a song with a pitch pipe or a song that anybody want to listen to. You can't make melody on it. It only has the keys so that you can do it, and then the do, mi, so, you get your starting note. The other thing that is different from a piano or a guitar or anything else, or a harp, is that a pitch pipe is played and then it's immediately put away. When I get the pitch when I'm leading singing, I do the pitch, do, mi, so, and I stick it in my pocket. And that's the last you hear of it, unless I'm leading another song. And so a musical instrument is one that forms a combination of rhythmic notes, and it forms a melody or a harmony. A pitch pipe can't do that. A tuning fork can't do that. Nobody accompanies the singing with a pitch pipe. And like I said, it's quickly put aside. It's not played during the song. Well, what about songbooks? It's like a songbook. The songbook helps us as we sing along. So yeah, the piano kind of helps us sing as we sing along. Well, we do have songbooks to help us carry out the command to sing. In order to fulfill the command to sing, we've got to have a song to sing. We don't have to use songbooks. We could use the book of Psalms and agree on a particular tune that we've memorized. We could sing from our memory. We could purchase songbooks that have songs that allow us to fulfill the command to sing. So, we've got several options here to fulfill the command to sing. But a musical instrument is not the same thing as a songbook. A songbook is not another type of music. It just tells you what the words and the melody is that you sing along to. The musical instrument actually creates another kind of music. And we're going to talk about that again here in just a moment. But I want to use a different parallel argument. When we think about the Lord's Supper, we're commanded to partake of the Lord's Supper. Now, we have purchased these things to help us in transporting it around. And we purchased a whole bunch of little containers. We could do one container. We could just have one big cup that's filled and pass it around. whether we believe that we have to use one cup or not. We could still do that. As was the case during the pandemic, we could have a whole bunch of individual ones that are available that aren't carried around in that. And everybody just brings their own in, or they grab one that's available. Or we could have this and we have people passing it around. And so we got different ways we can execute that command. The containers are like the songbook. It's not an addition to what we do, but it allows us to carry out the command. Now, we're not free to go substitute. I really need Dr. Pepper in the morning. And so instead of fruit of the vine, we'll put some Dr. Pepper in there, or put some Coca-Cola in there. Nor can we add some pretzels or some other food that maybe appeals to me more. We don't change the elements. We use what God's commanded. The containers and the songbooks just aid in the obedience. They don't replace what is commanded. And that's one of the keys to remember on any of these. An aid helps you do what God commands. An aid does not replace or do something competitive to what God has commanded. And the instrumental music is competitive to the singing. This is probably one of the better arguments. I would say this is one of the stronger arguments that is used, and that is in Ephesians 5:19, that word that was translated make melody, and I can't pull the slide back up, you can look at it in your scripture and in Colossians. There's the word translated make melody is a Greek word called psallo. Looks a lot like psalms, not surprisingly. And it's translated in most major translations as make melody. Now, Greek experts tell us that, well, let me make this first observation, is that the Bible translators, who are Greek experts, at least on the New Testament side, translate psallo as make melody. They don't translate it as play. So that's one thing to kind of lock in our mind. In old times, older than New Testament times, the word psallo did mean to pluck, to twang as a bowstring. So when you pull it and you pluck the bowstring. An instrument, plucking like a guitar, or a carpenter's chalk. Line up the chalk, you pop it, that's psallo. That word, that's what it meant originally. And so you can, to pluck, okay, hey, that's starting to sound. And when you go back to the Psalms, and you know the history of David, and David doing singing a lot of Psalms, he did it while playing. He did that in Saul's presence when the disturbing spirit would come. And so it would make sense to, okay, well, if we find psallo here, we find make melody, to pluck, it's implying an instrument. And that's why I said this is probably one of the stronger, honest arguments to try to say that God intended us to use instruments. However, there's a problem with this. That word psallo did mean that for long periods of time, but by the New Testament time, and again, going to the Greek scholars who especially don't have any axe to grind, they don't have anything they're trying to advocate, they're just saying by the time we get to the New Testament, the word came to mean sing. You know, there's words that change over time. You know, there's a lot of words that change over time in their meaning. One that's often used, and I think rightly so, is the word gay. So if you go to old Christmas, you know, the Christmas songs, 24 hours, once we get past Thanksgiving on some stations. And Deck the Halls includes a line, don we now our gay apparel. Because at the time that song was written, gay apparel designated something that meant happiness and frivolity and celebration. You know, so I'm putting on apparel that reflects a happy spirit. And the word gay was often used to talk about one's spirit being happy. Now, in our time, the word has come to denote a homosexual behavior. In fact, it's part of the longest acronym LGB, everything else. And so that's its common use. We don't, you know, come to the assembly, well, that's very nice. That's very gay apparel that you're wearing there. No, it would sound kind of awkward. It's interesting, my dad's middle name was gay. There was a, going back in history, it was a last name, and we're big on doing family names, but it had changed over the course of his life to the point that he didn't even just do Joe G. Davis. He just did Joe Davis. He didn't even list his middle initial. He didn't like it. He didn't acknowledge it. On his tombstone is just Joe Davis. And so words change over time, and this is what happened with Solomon. Yeah, it meant to pluck. It had all these kind of meanings before, but by the time we come to the New Testament, it meant to sing. There was a Greek scholar named Sophocles. He was a native Greek. He came to America. He was a professor of Greek at Harvard University for about 40 years. He published a Greek lexicon of the Roman and the Byzantine period. So, I mean, he's an extreme expert in the Greek language. In his examination of Greek literature from 146 BC, so 146 years before the birth of Christ, roughly, to 1100 AD, he did not find a single instance where solo was used to mean sing with instrumental accompaniment. So over that span of time, that he didn't find that use of the word. Henry Thayer, in his Greek English lexicon, and some of you may have a Thayer's lexicon of the New Testament, he says, in the New Testament, to sing a hymn, to celebrate the praises of God in song, is the meaning of Solomon. W.E. Vines, many of you may have Vines Expository Dictionary of New Testament words, and it's available online. You could Google search it. I mean, you actually search in Vines on Google now. He says it denotes in the New Testament to sing a hymn or sing praise. The 160 translators of the American Standard Version and the New King James translate it as sing or make melody. And what is interesting is nearly all of the translators were members of the church that used instrumental music. So even though their practice was this, their Greek scholarship said, no, this is what this word means, is make melody. It doesn't mean play. If, for the sake of argument, that we assumed that solo meant pluck and therefore implied an instrument, well, if we assume it means pluck, only stringed instruments could be used. You can't use wind instruments, can't use horns or percussion instruments like drums or electronic keyboards. You can't pluck any of those. And if solo means play, then once again, everybody's got to play because everyone is to solo, just as they are to sing and make melody. So again, we're going to be a congregational band. Get your harps ready. Even if solo meant to pluck, solo is a verb and it needs a direct object. So what is that which is plucked? It doesn't mention instrument in there. In Ephesians 5:19, the heart would be the direct object of the verb. Make melody in your heart. Solo your heart. So it's your heart that is to be plucked. So again, if you want to go completely down that solo road, you still end up with no instrument in your hand. And so when we think about the Greek scholars dispute that meaning in New Testament times, if it's true, again, everyone would play an instrument. And even those who advocate instrumental music and worship don't advocate that we all have to play. There is one argument that I can't answer. When it comes to instrumental music and worship and introducing instrumental music and worship, there is one argument that I cannot answer. We like it and we want it, and so we're going to have it. I can't help you with that. Because at that point, that cannot be answered because the person who makes that argument is ignoring the Bible as God's authority. You're like, I hear what you're saying about Salo, and I hear what you're saying about all these other things, but I just like the sound of the instrument. My kids play very good instruments. Grandmother used to play a piano in the denomination that she came out of, and I just think we need to do it. Okay, well, if we're going to ignore God's authority, I've got nothing for you at that point. However, I will remind you that Matthew 7:21 says only those who do the Father's will can go to heaven. So if we're not going to do the Father's will, then you're on your own on the day of judgment for that. And if we determine worship according to our own wills and appeal to our own taste, then we have left God and his authority behind already. As we observed before, it is unquestionably safe to understand from the scriptures, from the New Testament, that we are commanded to sing. The command to sing, by its nature, excludes any other kind of music. So I want to briefly just talk about two types of authority, generic and specific authority. Generic authority authorizes all things within a particular class. Specific authority is that which excludes, is exclusive in that it defines something to be done and excludes other things in that class. If I tell you, we're working together, go get us something to eat, and you go out and bring us pizza, that's fine. If you go out and bring us hamburgers, that's fine. If you go back and bring salad, that's not really what I wanted. It's like, well, you didn't tell me what you wanted. You just told me to go get something to eat. You can eat salad. Okay, fine. If I go out and tell you, all right, go get us some hamburgers, and you come back with salad, I'm like, well, you have wronged me. I asked you for a hamburger, and you brought me a salad. You brought me a serpent when I asked you for fish. So we understand just in our relationship, and that's all God's doing. He's communicating to us. Sometimes he says, look, just do this. You figure it out. And then sometimes God says, this is how I want this done. And again, I think principles from the Old Testament help us. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 14, I think it's probably one of the best things. You always hear this in authority lesson. The reason why? Because it's a good one. So in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 14, God tells Noah to go build an ark out of gopher wood. And if he would have just said, go out and get wood, be fine. What do we got? Got some pine, got some maple, got wood. Okay, what's good ark building wood? God tells him, no, I want you to build it out of gopher wood. And he gives him a lot of specifications on size and other such things. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 28 and 29, when Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, we have unleavened bread that is used because it was what was used in the Passover feast. And we have fruit of the vine that was present, that was part of the Passover feast. It wasn't just food and drink. If it was just food and drink, do what you want. And we find that example in Leviticus chapter 10 and verses 1 and 2. When Nadab and Abihu were struck by God, they were struck by God, and God told Aaron it's because they brought strange fire to me. What is strange fire? I told you where to get the fire from. It wasn't just bring fire, bring it from the incense. It's no, this is how I want you to do it. And you can imagine Nadab and Abihu. Fire is fire. It burns. It doesn't really matter where it starts from. How can you know this fire didn't come from here or here or here? Well, God knows. And God let them know. In Malachi chapter 1 and verse 8, God is displeased with their sacrifices. It is like they're bringing lambs, but they were bringing those that were blemished. They were bringing those that were lame, about ready to die anyway. No, God's displeased with them because he didn't say bring me lambs. He asked for specific type lambs. Among other things relevant to Malachi 1 verse 8 is lambs that were without blemish. In fact, this way of authority is used in the New Testament regarding Jesus. In Hebrews chapter 7, it talks about the priesthood and Jesus being a king and a priest. Well, Jesus is pretty easy to fit into the king category because he's of the tribe of Judah. He's of the descendants of David. There is a problem because of a passage in Jeremiah that if he were to rule on a physical throne in Israel, he would not be successful. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but that's out there. But the bigger one is, if he's going to be a priest, he couldn't be a priest under the old law. Therefore, there has to be a new law, because he is not of the tribe of Aaron. He's not of the tribe of Levi, the descendant of Aaron. And so he's a priest after the order of Melchizedek, which goes before the law. And one of the arguments that the Hebrew writer makes in verse 14, he says about this, you have to have a new priesthood, you have to have a new law and covenant as a result, because it is evident our Lord descended from Judah. In connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about the priest. Well, if he didn't say it, I guess it's okay. No, the Hebrew writers, because he said the priests are from Levi, everybody else is excluded. I didn't have to say the priests will come from the tribe of Levi, not Reuben, Asher, Dan. Now, I want them from here. You're in the tribe of Asher, get out of here. You're not. This is for Levi. And so when God specifies something, then of necessity, it excludes those other things. So when we look at, we kind of bring these thoughts to a close, nobody disagrees that singing and worship is authorized. Music is defined as the combination of notes that form a melody or harmony. So commanding a specific type of music, singing, excludes other types of music, playing, the instruments. If God just said, make music to me, then fine, we can use instruments. But once God has specified, this is the type of music that I want you to sing because you're praising me with words or you're encouraging one another. Of necessity, it excludes the other things. And what's interesting, and I want to kind of fire off a bunch of these quotes. Bible scholars have acknowledged the ancient church practice of singing without instruments, even when their religious groups had adopted the practice. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Catholic scholar, says, at that time, our church does not use musical instruments as harps and psalteries to praise God so that she may not seem to Judaize, as was the music of the temple. John Wesley, Methodist, founder of the Methodist Church, I have no objective to organs in our chapels, provided they're neither seen nor heard. Alexander Campbell said to all spiritually minded Christians, such aids as instruments would be like a cowbell in a concert. Charles Spurgeon, a very noted Baptist theologian and scholar, said, I would as soon pray to God with machinery as to sing to God with machinery. Benedict, who is a Baptist historian, says, in my earliest intercourse among this people, congregational singing generally prevailed among them. The instrument, specifically he's talking about an organ, which from time immemorial has been associated with the cathedral pomp and ecclesiastical power, has always been the peculiar favorite of the national churches, at length found its way into Baptist sanctuaries. Staunch old Baptists in former times would as soon tolerated the Pope of Rome in their pulpits as an organ in their galleries, and yet the instrument has gradually found its way among them. Joseph Bingham, an Anglican scholar, said, music in the churches is as ancient as the apostles, but instrumental music, not so. Martin Luther, under the Lutheran movement, the organ in the worship is an insignia of Baal, the idol. Erasmus, who is a 16th century theologian, we have brought into our churches certain operatic and theatrical music, such a confused, disorderly chattering of some words as I hardly think was ever in any of the Grecian or Roman theaters. The church rings with the noise of trumpets, pipes, and dulcimers, and human voices strive to bear their part with them. Men run to the church as to a theater to have their ears tickled. And for this end, organ makers are hired with great salaries and a company of boys who waste all their time learning these whining tones. Erasmus was not in favor of the organ, just in case you didn't get that. The other thing to think about was say, okay, well, if we establish vocal singing, what about choirs. Well, no, that's excluded because the singing is to one another. We're all to sing with one another. And this is where we get to one thing where we have to be careful, and I am closing this. We have to be careful that when we establish the Bible authority for something, to not forget to establish the Bible authority for something else. If we say no instruments of music, that God has commanded singing, okay, now what does he expect from us when we sing? The emphasis is not on the beauty of our voice, but the blending of our voices to God and building up one another. He didn't say your singing had to be pretty. So don't get self-conscious about your singing. Just sing out. It's the words of encouragement that's most important. We've got to sing songs that teach the truth of God's word. You know, we could sing patriotic songs and all kind of other things that have nothing to do with the worship of God. That wouldn't be appropriate for the worship of God. Psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Our singing should be from the heart, and we honor God by offering the best that we can do. Again, it's not the quality of our voice, but if we say we're not using instrumental music, we sing because that's commanded, then let us sing. And let's sing and let's do the best that we can in our singing. Here again is the reasons we don't use this in our worship, the arguments that are made for it. When we look through the scriptures, we know we're commanded to sing, and specific command excludes playing musical instruments. The ancient church did not use musical instruments, though they could be found in the Jewish temple worship and they could be found around pagan society. It's not like instruments had not been invented at that time. Although it was used in the Old Testament, we see it symbolically in the book of Revelation. There's no New Testament authority for its use in the worship of Christ in the church. They're not an aid to singing, but an additional type of music, competitive to singing. And so they should be excluded. The Greek words used in the commands to sing do not authorize the use of musical instruments and reinforce the focus on singing words of praise to God that encourage one another. And most importantly on this and a whole bunch of other issues, we don't worship to please ourselves, we worship to please God. And so we do the things that he's commanded and the way he has commanded to honor him. I appreciate your attention to the lesson. If you'll turn your songbooks to the Song of Invitation. It's a song to encourage us to be faithful to God, whether it's a matter of repentance, as we've already heard, to the glory of God at the beginning of this service, or it's one in making a commitment of our relationship to God. This song we often sing is an opportunity to do that. And so if you want to respond in any way, please come while we stand and while we sing this song.